Was ADHD actually a Stone Age superpower? Two hunters, same landscape, same morning, same objective. The first one is moving carefully through tall grass, eyes fixed on the animal trail ahead. He's been tracking a deer for 2 hours. He's focused, patient, methodical. He registers what's in front of him and filters out the rest. A good hunter, steady. The second one can't do this. His eyes keep moving. Every sound pulls his attention sideways. A bird lifting from a branch 40 meters to the left. Something in the peripheral vision, too fast to be wind. A smell that wasn't there a moment ago. He can't hold his gaze on the trail for more than a few seconds before something else grabs it. He misses the deer. He misses the deer almost every time. What he doesn't miss is the leopard. It had been still for 20 minutes in the undergrowth to the right, eyes barely open, waiting. Not on the trail, not where anyone was looking, just far enough off the path that a focused hunter wouldn't register it as anything other than shadow. The second hunter saw it before it moved. His brain, incapable of sustained filtering, had caught it the way it catches everything, not because he was looking for it, but because he was looking for everything simultaneously. He made a sound. The group scattered. The leopard missed. We call the second hunter's brain a disorder. The people who almost got eaten by the leopard might have had a different word for it. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is one of the most common neurodevelopmental conditions documented in human populations. It affects somewhere between 5 and 7% of children worldwide, and somewhere between 2 and 5% of adults, though estimates vary depending on diagnostic criteria and population studied. It has a genetic heritability of approximately 74 to 80%, meaning the overwhelming majority of its variance is explained by genetics rather than environment. It has been present in every population studied. It runs in families with a consistency that is unusual, even for strongly heritable traits. It is also a relatively recent disorder, not because the brains didn't exist before, because the label didn't. The formal diagnostic criteria for what we now call ADHD were first codified in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published in 1980. Before that, various versions of the condition had been described under different names: minimal brain dysfunction, hyperkinetic reaction of childhood, others, without consensus on what exactly was being described or why. The clinical category as we currently understand it, with its specific criteria for inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity across multiple settings, is roughly 4 decades old. The brains it describes are considerably older. To understand what ADHD is at the neurological level, you need to understand one specific system: dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger involved in reward, motivation, attention, and the regulation of movement. It's not the pleasure chemical it's often described as in popular accounts. It's more accurately described as the salience chemical. Dopamine signals to the brain, "This matters. Pay attention to this. This is worth pursuing." In neurotypical brains, dopamine is released in response to a relatively wide range of stimuli, both novel and familiar, both immediate and anticipated. A routine task that will eventually produce a reward generates sufficient dopamine signaling to sustain attention through the less interesting parts. In brains with ADHD, the dopamine system works differently. Dopamine receptors are less sensitive or fewer in number in key regions. The system releases dopamine robustly in response to novelty, stimulation, and immediate reward. It sustains dramatically lower dopamine signaling in response to routine, repetition, and delayed reward. This creates a specific, inconsistent pattern: difficulty sustaining attention on tasks that are routine or low stimulation, combined with intense, sometimes overwhelming engagement with tasks that are novel, stimulating, or immediately rewarding. The result is a brain that is not equally responsive to all situations. It is a brain with a strong preference for the high end of the stimulation spectrum. A brain that the low stimulation middle of normal life keeps failing to engage. This is not a broken brain. This is a brain with a different threshold for what counts as important. And in certain environments, that threshold is not a disadvantage at all. Picture the cognitive demands of a hunter-gatherer landscape, not a modern landscape, not a landscape with streets and screens and offices and classrooms. A landscape of tall grass, scattered woodland, seasonal rivers, a horizon that shifts as you move through it. A landscape where the information relevant to your survival is distributed across your entire visual and auditory field, where it arrives unpredictably, and where missing it has immediate physical consequences. In this environment, sustained focus on a single object or task is not the primary cognitive skill required. What's required is something considerably closer to what ADHD brains do naturally: constant, distributed scanning of the environment for anything that deviates from the expected pattern, movement where there shouldn't be movement, a silence that replaced sound, a smell that arrived without wind. The hunter-gatherer brain that worked best in this landscape was not necessarily the brain with the strongest sustained focus. It was the brain that couldn't stop scanning. The brain that noticed the bird lift from the branch. The brain that registered the shadow that stayed still for slightly too long. The brain that was impossible to bore because it was never fully attending to only one thing. That brain was the early warning system for the group. In 1993, an author and ADHD researcher named Tom Hartmann proposed what he called the hunter versus farmer theory. The basic idea: the traits that constitute ADHD are not disorders at all. They are the cognitive profile of the hunter running in a world that increasingly demands the cognitive profile of the farmer. Hunters need to scan constantly, to respond instantly to novel stimuli, to take rapid decisions with incomplete information, to pursue a promising trail with intense, urgent focus before the moment passes, to abandon a trail that's gone cold without spending much time on the transition, to tolerate and even enjoy the unpredictability of the chase. Farmers need to sustain attention on repetitive tasks across long periods of time, to plan ahead over months and seasons, to tolerate boredom and routine as the essential fabric of productive work, to regulate impulsive behavior in the service of long-term outcomes, to sit still. ADHD brains are excellent hunters. They are extremely poor farmers. For most of human history, everyone was a hunter. Hartmann's theory has been criticized as oversimplified, and the criticism has some merit. The cognitive demands of hunter-gatherer life were more varied than the theory implies. Gathering required patience and sustained attention. Social cooperation required impulse control. Navigation required sequential planning. The hunter profile doesn't map cleanly onto every element of forager life. But the core observation that the attentional profile of ADHD is better adapted to some environments than others, and that modern industrial environments represent a particularly poor fit, has attracted more rigorous scientific support since 1993. In 1999, a research team led by Chuan-Cheng Chen published a study examining the distribution of a specific genetic variant across different human populations. The variant in question was the DRD47 repeat allele, a version of the gene that codes for a dopamine receptor, and one that has been consistently associated with ADHD traits including novelty seeking, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. What Chen's team found was striking. The 7 repeat allele was significantly more common in populations with historically nomadic lifestyles than in populations with historically settled, agricultural ones, nomadic groups that moved regularly through changing landscapes, that needed to respond quickly to environmental shifts, that couldn't afford the cognitive profile of routine and patience that farming demands, carried this allele at higher rates. This is not proof that ADHD is an adaptation specifically for nomadic life. Genetics is considerably more complex than single alleles explaining single behavioral traits. But it is consistent with the hypothesis, and it's the kind of finding that makes the evolutionary story harder to dismiss. Peter Jensen, a psychiatrist at Columbia University, published a more formal version of the evolutionary argument in 1997. Jensen proposed that ADHD traits, hyperactivity, impulsivity, novelty seeking, constant environmental scanning, were adaptive responses to a specific ancestral environment, and that what we now call ADHD is essentially a mismatch between a brain calibrated for that environment and the demands of modern institutional life. His paper, published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, put the idea into the scientific literature in a form that subsequent researchers could engage with seriously. The debate it opened has not been resolved, but it has shifted the question from what is wrong with this brain to what environment was this brain built for. Now think about hyperfocus. Hyperfocus is one of the most misunderstood aspects of ADHD, partly because it seems to contradict the name. A condition called attention deficit disorder produces people who can sit for 6 hours working on something that interests them, missing meals, losing track of time, ignoring everything happening around them. This apparent contradiction resolves immediately when you understand the dopamine system. ADHD brains don't have a deficit of attention. They have a deficit of attention regulation in low stimulation contexts. When the dopamine system is sufficiently engaged, when the task is novel enough, stimulating enough, immediately rewarding enough, the ADHD brain doesn't struggle with attention at all. It locks in with an intensity that non-ADHD brains often can't match. In the ancestral environment, what tasks produced this level of engagement? A hunt that was going well, a trail that was fresh, an immediate threat, a social situation with high stakes and unpredictable dynamics, a problem that required rapid creative solution under pressure. The ADHD brain in hyperfocus was the brain that didn't give up on the track when it got difficult. That pressed through exhaustion when the animal was close. That stayed absolutely locked on the situation when the situation demanded everything. The frustration was the Monday morning after the hunt, when the task was sorting and storing and doing the same thing in the same sequence for the fourth hour in a row. There was one more thing that ADHD brains contributed to ancestral groups that tends to get overlooked in discussions of attention and scanning. Risk tolerance, the impulsivity that makes ADHD difficult in modern contexts, the tendency to act before fully calculating consequences, to pursue immediate reward over delayed outcomes, to make fast decisions with incomplete information, is also the profile of someone who tries things that haven't been tried before, who walks further than the safe perimeter, who climbs to see what's on the other side of the ridge, who tests the unfamiliar plant or the new route or the novel tool in a stable environment where all the relevant information is already mapped and the optimal behavior is known. This profile is counterproductive. In an unstable environment where new information is constantly needed, and the cost of excessive caution can be starvation, having some members of the group who can't stop themselves from investigating new things is not a liability. It's how the group finds out what's over the next ridge before conditions force them to find out. Groups with no risk takers were groups that didn't discover new food sources before the existing ones ran out. Groups with only risk takers were groups that made too many fatal errors too quickly. The ADHD distribution of roughly 5 to 7% of the population may not be accidental. It may represent something close to an optimal proportion for a group navigating an unpredictable world. Enough to ensure that someone was always pushing into unknown territory, not so many that the group's stability was constantly undermined by impulsive decisions. This kind of frequency-dependent selection, where a trait is advantageous at low to moderate frequency in a population but disadvantageous if it becomes too common, is well documented in evolutionary biology. It would explain why ADHD traits have persisted in human populations across thousands of years of agricultural civilization, not because they were still advantageous in farming societies, but because they conferred enough advantage in the contexts where they did appear that the genes carrying them were maintained rather than selected out, and then the world changed. The agricultural revolution began approximately 10,000 years ago. Farming required something that the ancestral environment had never systematically demanded: the ability to perform the same task, in the same sequence, across the same landscape, for months at a time, with the reward arriving not at the end of a successful hunt, but at the end of a successful season. Plant the seeds. Water the seeds, watch the seeds, remove weeds from around the seeds, water again, wait more. The crop takes months. The reward is invisible for most of that time. The work is repetitive, spatially confined, and generates very little moment-to-moment stimulation. The farmer who abandoned a field because something more interesting was happening 2 valleys over was a farmer whose family went hungry in winter. Patience, routine, sustained attention to low-stimulation repetitive work, impulse control in the service of long-term outcomes. The cognitive demands of farming are almost precisely the inverse of the cognitive demands the ADHD brain is calibrated for. For the first time in human history, one cognitive profile was systematically more productive than another in the dominant economic activity of the species. And that economic activity proceeded to organize itself into settlements, and then cities, and then institutions, and then schools. For several thousand years after agriculture began, this was survivable. Agricultural life was still physically demanding, socially varied, and embedded in small communities where different cognitive profiles could find different roles. The ADHD farmer might struggle with field work, but thrive as the trader, the soldier, the itinerant merchant, the storyteller, the person who went to find out what was in the next valley, because staying in one place made them anxious. Then came the school. Picture a specific child, 8 years old. He has been sitting at a desk for 35 minutes. The teacher is explaining long division for the second time today. He understood it the first time, but the second explanation is slower, and he is already disengaged from it. His pencil is tapping. His left leg is bouncing under the desk without him noticing. Through the window, he can see a pigeon landing on a fence, and then a second pigeon, and then the first one leaves, and he wonders where it goes, and whether pigeons remember places they've been to before, and whether there's a study on that, and he's fairly sure he saw something about bird memory last week, and his name is said sharply from the front of the room. He looks up. 23 other children are looking at him. The teacher asks if he'd like to share what's so interesting. He doesn't have an answer that will help him here. This child is not failing to pay attention. He is paying attention to several things simultaneously, none of which are the long division problem on the board, because the long division problem generates insufficient dopamine to compete with the pigeon and the memory study, and the question that spun off from that. The modern classroom is, from the perspective of an ADHD brain, one of the most inhospitable environments ever designed. Sit still, face forward, attend to one specific thing for 45 minutes, then switch to a different specific thing for another 45 minutes. Repeat for 8 hours. The stimulation level is designed to be neutral. The reward is deferred by months. The novelty is controlled and rationed. Movement is a disciplinary infraction. A brain built to scan a landscape for movement, to engage instantly with novel stimuli, to hyperfocus when something genuinely interesting appears and immediately disengage when the interesting thing resolves. That brain in a classroom is not simply disordered. It is also, at least in part, in the wrong environment. The difficulties are real, but so is the mismatch. Now picture someone else, not a child at a desk, an adult at a laptop in 2024. 3 projects open simultaneously, 14 browser tabs, 2 unfinished messages, a new idea that arrived during a meeting and got written on a receipt because the notebook wasn't in reach. He has missed 2 deadlines this month. He has also, in the last 6 months, noticed a connection between 2 completely unrelated problems that nobody else on the team saw, solved a crisis that arrived without warning in under an hour, and built something from scratch in a weekend that his colleagues estimated would take a month. In a classroom, this brain is a problem. In a slowly changing environment that rewards consistent execution of known procedures, this brain is a problem. In a fast-moving, unpredictable, high-stimulation environment that rewards rapid pattern recognition, creative connection, and immediate response to novel situations, this brain is something else. Emergency medicine, entrepreneurship, investigative journalism, competitive athletics, crisis management. The environments where adults with ADHD most frequently report that their brain finally feels like an asset are the environments most similar in basic structure to the ancestral landscape. High stakes, variable, immediate, requiring full scanning attention from someone who cannot reduce the world to a single point of focus. This doesn't mean ADHD is not real. It is real. The neurological differences are documented and measurable across decades of brain imaging research. The difficulties are genuine and can be significant. The suffering that comes from living in an environment that systematically punishes your cognitive profile is real suffering, not a misunderstanding. But it does mean that calling it a disorder, rather than a mismatch, is a choice about framing that has consequences. A disorder implies the brain is broken and needs to be fixed. A mismatch implies the brain and the environment are out of alignment, and that the alignment is what needs addressing. Consider what ADHD brains tend to do well when placed in environments that match their calibration. They perform well in fast-paced, high-stimulation situations that demand rapid responses. They generate creative solutions under pressure. They notice things that slower, more methodical processing misses. They make connections across unrelated domains. They take risks that produce breakthroughs. Emergency medicine, entrepreneurship, competitive sports, creative fields, crisis management, the environments where ADHD adults most frequently report that their brain finally feels like an asset rather than a liability are the environments most similar, in their basic structure, to the ancestral landscape. High stakes, variable, immediate, requiring the full scanning attention of someone who cannot filter the world down to a single point of focus. The hunter who noticed the leopard didn't need to be fixed. He needed to be in a landscape where noticing everything was the skill that kept people alive. For most of human history, that was the landscape everyone lived in. The grain of the world and the grain of that particular brain ran in the same direction. Then the grain of the world changed. The brain is still running the original software. Go back to the 2 hunters in the tall grass. The first one tracked the deer. Patient-focused. Methodical. He fed the group on good days. The second one missed the deer but caught the leopard. Not because he was trying to, because he couldn't stop his brain from registering everything simultaneously, and everything included the shadow that stayed still for slightly too long. For 300,000 years, groups needed both of them, the deer tracker and the leopard noticer, the sustained attention brain and the constantly scanning brain, each one covering the blind spot of the other. The classroom has a grade for one of them. The other one keeps being asked to please sit still and pay attention. He is paying attention to everything.